Hello, I'm Paul Larson. A children's book author from Ogdensburg, New York says a chaotic holiday season had wiped away the Christmas magic from her life, until she wrote a novel for adults to recapture the nostalgic whimsy of the season. In this author visit, Barbara Briggs Ward talks about The Reindeer Keeper, a novel that won top honors for adult fiction from the Mom's Choice Awards. What compelled you to want to write The Reindeer Keeper?
It was 3 years ago after Christmas in January. After the hustle and bustle of Christmas, I felt exhausted and found myself I hadn't even enjoyed Christmas. And I thought, I mustn't be alone. I mustn't be the only adult out there who felt the same. And I had had an inkling of a story in my head that had been going through my head all Christmas season. And come January, I felt compelled to sit down and write whatever came out from this title. The title was The Reindeer Keeper. I had the title in my mind, and I had my grandfather's old barn in my mind. But other than that, that's all I had. I knew I had a story within me for adults that wanted to bring adults back to that feeling of how they felt at Christmas, to make them really enjoy the true wonder of the season again.
So this is sort of a return to childhood in terms of the emotion in the book?
Yes. It's told through the lives of Abby and Steve. They've been married 30 years. They met in the 60s. This is 30 years later when they've inherited an old farmhouse and a barn full of reindeer tended to by an odd little man named Thomas. So they've inherited it just before Christmas and they move in. And the storyline is that, you know, while it's the day-to-day setting in their lives, during Christmas they are brought back to that special feeling we felt as children.
Now, where is the story set?
In my mind, it was set in the Green Mountains of Vermont, more of a New England setting.
Would you like to read a passage from the book?
I would love to. The heroine is Abby. She's trying to go to sleep, but she can't, and it's Christmas Eve. Abby tried talking herself into falling asleep, but it was another one of those nights. By 2:35, she'd made a cup of tea and was sitting on the sofa. The moon shimmering through the darkness lit the room, drawing her attention to a particular photo set back on a shelf. Putting the cup down, Abby went over and stood staring at her parents on their wedding day. Even in the shadows, Abby couldn't deny how beautiful a woman her mother had been, smiling with her dark hair pulled back and veil of lace falling past her shoulders to her small waist. This woman dressed in satin was looking at her husband with obvious love in her eyes. From nowhere came tears. From nowhere came a yearning for this stranger who carried her for 9 months and delivered her on a cold January morning. Abby used her finger to clear away any dust from the photo to get an even better look. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Abby noticed a sudden brightness coming from outside. At first she thought it was the shimmering moon among the silver stars, but the brightness intensifies. It drew Abby to the far window of the back fields. Colorful sparkles were swirling over the land. Between the snow falling and the moon dancing, it was a sight that took her breath away. Abby's attention turned to the barn. It was lit up as she'd never seen it before. She knew Thomas was there. He had to be.
It's very picturesque, your writing. Now, you
Yes.
published this book yourself?
Yes, I have been published by a publisher for some children's books. But when it came to this, I felt that I wouldn't be able to find a publisher, a mainstream publisher, interested in publishing a seasonal story by really an unknown author. So I did a lot of research and I found myself a self-publishing firm that I felt had the quality that I was looking for, because I knew the book had to be quality and it had to compete with other titles out there.
So you said you actually sat down to write the book and you didn't exactly know where it was going.
Right.
Now, how quickly did the story take to develop?
Well, there's a little background here, because while I had been writing for children, and I've been published in Chicken Soup for the Soul and Highlights for Children, I've always wanted to write for adults, but a little voice in me told me, you can't do that. You don't have the ability to sit down long enough to take a story from beginning to end to make it sense that adults would like it. But after January, I had this story that was so strong in my mind that for adults that I had to just sit down and write it. And I found once I sat down to write it, The Reindeer Keeper, the main characters, Abby and Steve, actually, I tell people, took the story over. And they led me through the pages, and it was their story. And there were parts in that story that just, after I wrote it, I would just literally get up and cry, because Abby and Steve became my best friends, and what they do, they go through life like we do. They experienced joy and happiness and loss and sadness, and it was their story, and to write it was quite an emotional experience. But once I sat down to write it, the story just flew right out of me.
So you actually cried when you were writing it. Is it going to make the readers cry?
In a good way. It mirrors life. You know, I have so many people come up to me and say, oh, it reminded me of so-and-so in my family, or oh yes, we've been through that. I didn't want like a fairy tale story. It mirrors what we all go through, but it's a beautiful story of family and Christmas, and it's inspired people to touch back to their Christmases years ago, which is just what I wanted it to do.
There are also some pretty strong emotions among family members in the story. For example, Abby and her mother.
Mm-hmm. Abby's always felt resentment towards her mother. Her mother died when Abby was a young girl, and she never forgave her mother for leaving her. So it's dealing with these issues.
And I know you were inspired a bit by your own family. You mentioned your grandfather's barn plays a role in the inspiration. Also, your own father. Tell me his story.
My father, growing up, my father was a funeral director, and I didn't realize growing up how much of, when we were older, when I was in early 20s, we moved above the funeral home. And I never really realized, having a father as a funeral director all those years, how much my father had taught me about life and living. And through the storyline, things that I had learned about my father and life and living come out in the story, because Abby is infatuated by obituaries, which, as I am, because I always looked at obituaries as little stories about people, just little glimpses of people's lives. You know, we have no control over the beginning date or the end date, but as Abby says, and I always tell my children, we have a lot to say about the middle. You know, I always tried to tell my children that, you know, don't ever feel you're stuck in life, that if you're unhappy, do something about it, because it's truly up to you. You control the middle part of your obituary, and I learned all that from my father.
Well, that's all very insightful. Who would you say the target audience is for this book?
I wrote the book more for people, they say baby boomer age, but people who are a little older, who've experienced more of life, more of loss in life, and rearing children, and how hard that is, how joyful it is, but how hard it is from day to day. So it's more for adults who've experienced more of that, because they'll understand more of where the main characters come from. They've been married 30 years. She's had cancer. You know, she's resentful of her mother. She just lost her father, who she was very close to. These are all emotions we all share, besides the cancer. So it's more for people who've lived more of life.
Didn't you bring a letter from one of your readers?
Yes, I received a letter from a gentleman who said, he told me he sat down one evening and read the whole book. He couldn't put it down. Between laughing and a lot of crying, he told me how it touched him. He wrote, he said, after reading your book, I began thinking of past Christmases when I'd visit my grandfather with my sister and my family. This prompted me to contact my sister, whom I hadn't spoken to in years. I visited her, and I gave her a copy of The Reindeer Keeper. The Reindeer Keeper has brought us together, and he thanked me for writing the book. And I think, first of all, for him just to feel that kind of emotion and to write me a letter it made my day, because that really showed that the characters had done what I'd hoped they would do.
What a wonderful thing to have happen. Someone reads your book and then actually takes action and contacts a sister who he hadn't spoken to in years.
I felt that The Reindeer Keeper, some part of me thought, well, maybe that's why I was supposed to write the book. You know, and I've had phone calls, and, you know, I would meet people here and there that I've traveled, that how The Reindeer Keeper has affected their family. So I'm very pleased at the outcome of The Reindeer Keeper. And from that, I've had a lot of people ask me for either a sequel or another book. So I'm now working on The Snowman Maker. It'll come out a year from this Christmas.
The author says The Snowman Maker will contain plenty of holiday cheer, and while it refers to the family from the first book, it actually tells the story of a different family. Author Visits is a production of Mountain Lake PBS. For more information about authors and their books, head to the Author Visits section of our website at mountainlake.org.